Hey Webters, Mr. Lassiter here with you, and I'm going to do a couple of short video lectures for you, hopefully short, that will cover some content we might not have time for in class for this first unit, but nevertheless it's very important, so find some time to watch these, and let's go ahead and get started. In this brief lecture we're going to be looking at Mesopotamia, one of our core civilizations that we've talked about in class, one of our core river valley civilizations. Mesopotamia, the name itself translates to the land between the waters, or land between the rivers, meaning the Tigris and Euphrates River. It's part of the greater Fertile Crescent, and this is where we see agriculture the Fertile Crescent is where we first see agriculture develop, and of course being in a fertile region encouraged farming. One of the things that Mesopotamians learned to do is irrigate their crops, so they're able to use the water in the region and bring it to the fields. We talked about that some the other day. By 3000 BCE, thereabouts, Sumer this region had about 100,000 people. It had city-states, kings, etc. So we start to see some of those hallmarks of civilization. We see state building, we see organized society, etc. So this kind of gives you an idea of the Fertile Crescent, although some would kind of swing it out further. You see the Hittite kingdom, the Assyrian kingdom, etc. Some of these places that will exist throughout history. As far as farming, irrigation and canals controlled the water supply in Mesopotamia for their farming. And flooding was important, certainly, to bring nutrients, but it was also very dangerous, which would inform a great deal of Mesopotamian culture. And we'll talk about that later, even literature traditions. Agriculture reached the region sometime around 8,000 years ago, probably, maybe even a little bit before. They domesticated animals, which would help them in labor and, of course, certainly provide materials for them. You see donkey, sheep, goats, oxen, horses by about 2000 BCE. Written record begins with the Sumerians. Sumerian language came into contact with Semitic languages. Eventually Akkadian takes precedent, and we have kind of these ancient dictionaries that give us knowledge of ancient Sumerian. The writing system originated as a system of kind of tokens, which were used in record keeping, basically. These tokens, which were then replaced, instead of having like a token with a picture of, let's say, an ox on it, as you were counting oxen, they were replaced just simply by the symbols. And then those symbols came to represent sounds, and this system of kind of wedge-shaped writing that develops, we know as cuneiform. And here is some examples of cuneiform writing, and you can see how it changed over the time period, because writing isn't just invented, but nevertheless it develops from outline characters, which you can see of the sun, which archaic cuneiform, it changes a little bit, and then by Assyrian and late Babylonian it changes even more. The word for God or heaven, the words for mountains or man or ox or fish, you can see there how they develop. And cuneiform writing was pressed into clay tablets, which would then harden and preserve that writing till this very day. As we talked about, cities developed in this region. That's one of the kind of necessities for civilization. That's where the root of that word comes from, the Latin for civil or city. And cities provided these pretty rural areas still, these farming areas, with protection and other goods. States developed for organization, so we see a state can be as small as a city. So we have city-states, self-governing urban centers, and its agricultural territories. Over time, we see groups like the Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians. They develop empires, right, which will conquer more than just their territory and will, in fact, encompass not just one group of people, but a very diverse population. There are kind of two centers of power in cities, the temple and the palace of the king. And remember, as we've talked about, religion and government go hand in hand in these early societies. Here's a good example of monumental building in Mesopotamia, ziggurats, which are these huge structures that we see in in Mesopotamia. And these were kind of public works projects, but not necessarily just for practical purposes. These large ziggurats encased religious practices that centered around these large buildings. People brought offerings of animals, vegetables, etc. Priests would offer sacrifices, both human and animal, which were thought to secure the goodwill of the gods. The ziggurat could perform social and military functions as well. And of course, there were temple schools where children would learn religion or math or geometry or other subjects. And technically, with just the accessible only by huge sets of stairs, the top of the ziggurat could also provide safety in times of flooding or invasion. But these required a lot of man hours, a lot of human labor, of course, which had to be organized. And the grander these were, of course, the more it showcased the power of the state. As far as religion in Mesopotamia, temples housed city-states' deities and their cults. Of course, we just talked about those ziggurats that we find. Around 3000 BC, we see kings come into power. They serve as kind of an earthly representative of the gods, and we'll see that when we talk about Hammurabi's Code. But they had responsibilities to the people, right? Upkeep and the building of temples, ensuring that rituals happened correctly to make sure the rivers would flood when they needed to and make sure the harvest came in. And then, of course, they're responsible for defense and justice and, of course, expansion. In Mesopotamia, we see gods embodying kind of the forces of nature. There's a sun god and a storm god and all these different representations of what's around them in the world. Mesopotamian region tended to believe in magic. And, of course, huge festivals were an important way of life and celebrating their religion. As far as social structures, this is kind of the social structure we see in Mesopotamia, with the monarchs and the priests and priestesses at the top. Again, government and religion right there at the top, all the way down through to the bottom rung of slaves. Now, one of the most famous emperors of Mesopotamia is Hammurabi, who ruled over Babylon and developed Hammurabi's Code, which is a law code that's documented on stone columns. Really, it has three major principles: retribution, or kind of the eye for an eye, the idea that there are harsher punishments for the lower classes. We see evidence of class-based systems in this, and this idea that the government is also responsible to its citizens. For example, if someone is robbed and the thief is not found, the government would reimburse the person who was robbed. Of course, the system of writing that we see, excuse me, went too fast there. The system of writing made it possible to create these law codes. And the Code of Hammurabi, which develops in Babylon, was written in cuneiform. The Babylonians had adopted cuneiform from the Sumerians. But, for example, the language Babylonian in the beginning, in the preamble to Hammurabi's Code, it says that Babylonian is the language of the courts, and that is the language that these laws are written in, so everybody must speak in. Hammurabi's Code is going to reinforce social and gender hierarchies. It's going to also provide, and I didn't put a picture in here, but I'll show you at some point. At the top of Hammurabi's Code literally is Hammurabi receiving the law from the sun god Shamash. And basically, people are just more likely to follow laws if they believe they have a divine origin. And so again, we see that close connection. And lastly, we're going to see art and culture develop in this region. And while there are many examples of it, probably the most important is the earliest literary tradition that we can find, and that is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which originated with the Sumerians of Mesopotamia. It's an epic poem, and it follows this hero Gilgamesh, who's believed to be based on this historical king, and his companion dies. And so Gilgamesh sets out to search for eternal life. Ultimately, he finds out that man is mortal and that eternal life is only for the gods. And this is going to contrast with Egyptian belief in the afterlife and many other societies' belief in the afterlife. And it's thought that this really just reflects the culture of ancient Mesopotamians and the beliefs of ancient Mesopotamians. Because if you remember, the Nile flooded predictably and was the giver of everything the Egyptians needed. So they had a very positive outlook in terms of their culture. Whereas Mesopotamian life could be very harsh and might be seen as more pessimistic, which can be reflected possibly in this ultimate realization of Gilgamesh that the afterlife was only for the gods and that humans were mere mortals. Oh, wrong direction. It's 81 degrees here. That's it, guys. So enjoy it. Hope you enjoyed it. And I will be back in another video, of course. Talk to you later.